What happens when Lord Champa, god of destruction of Universe 6, stumbles into Earth 6-1 scene, and I promise you, it goes exactly as ridiculous and exactly as terrifying as that sounds. It was a single energy reading, planet-sized, impossible, appearing from absolute nowhere, materializing directly above Earth's atmosphere like a second sun that genuinely had not been invited. Sword satellites began melting mid-scan. Tony Stark's HUD threw up readings it had never generated before, then simply gave up and displayed 3 question marks. The Avengers' systems flatlined. Doctor Strange felt the rules of magic go quiet. Not broken, not violated, just disregarded. The way a visitor from another country disregards local traffic laws because they simply don't know they exist. And then, cutting through every communication frequency on the planet simultaneously, came a voice, lazy, petulant, enormous, asking the single most ridiculous and most terrifying question this universe had ever received. So, who here has the best food? For 1 full second, the entire Marvel universe was confused. Every hero, every analyst, every ancient sorcerer cross-legged in a sanctum somewhere, all of them paused, because that is not how cosmic threats are supposed to sound. Cosmic threats send heralds. They make proclamations. They arrive wearing purpose and menace like a uniform. They do not drift above a planet in a divine haze, looking mildly bored, slightly out of breath, and immediately curious about the local cuisine. So in that 1 second, that single catastrophically expensive second, something dangerously foolish happened across every layer of Marvel's response network. From street-level heroes to galactic empires registering the anomaly on their long-range sensors. People almost laughed. And that almost laugh would cost them more than they knew. Because here is what you need to understand about Champa before this story goes where it's going. He is not disciplined, he is not strategic, he is not Beerus, his twin brother, the god of destruction of Universe 7, who at least carries a thin veneer of ancient composure beneath his volatility, who sleeps for decades between destructions, who has advisors he occasionally listens to. Champa skipped all of that. Champa is what happens when you give the most destructive force in a universe to someone who is also, simultaneously, the most petty, the most gluttonous, the most easily offended, and the most dangerously bored being you have ever encountered. And his attendant, Vados, his angel, infinitely more powerful and infinitely more composed, was floating exactly 3 feet behind him, sipping from a crystalline cup with the detached politeness of someone who has watched this exact situation unfold 10,000 times and stopped being surprised approximately 9,900 times ago. Within the first 4 minutes of his arrival, Champa had done 3 things. He had caused an asteroid belt at the edge of the solar system to cease existing, not because he intended to, but because a crumb from a pastry someone had left in his divine quarters had somehow ended up on his sash, and the momentary irritation of a ruined outfit triggered a reflex so casual it barely registered as a thought. He had yawned, releasing a pulse of divine energy that scattered 3 sword communication satellites like ash in wind. And he had scratched the back of his neck while scanning the planet below, the gesture alone generating a gravitational fluctuation that made every seismograph on Earth register what geologists would later describe in complete professional bafflement as a medium-sized earthquake with no identifiable source and no logical explanation. None of this was intentional. He was just existing, and his existence was already rewriting the baseline of what catastrophe meant in this universe. Vados observed all of this with the serene, mildly entertained expression she always wore when Champa was being Champa. She caught the Sword Director's emergency broadcast on a frequency she was passively monitoring and translated it for her own private amusement. They had classified the energy signature as Omega Divine Anomaly, category undefined. She considered correcting them, offering a more precise classification, a more accurate tier assessment, then decided against it. Accuracy, in this situation, would only make them more distressed. She sipped her drink. Below, Earth was mobilizing every defense it possessed. She gave those defenses approximately 11 minutes before they encountered the specific problem that all of Marvel's defenses shared. They had been built to address threats that came from inside this universe's logic, and Champa was a theorem from a different equation entirely. Dr. Strange felt it before he understood it. Standing in the Sanctum Sanctorum, reaching for analogies across every text his tradition possessed, every cosmic ally his network connected to, he kept arriving at the same dead end. Champa was not a demon, not a fallen deity, not a cosmic parasite or a dimensional conqueror. He was a foreign divine principle entering a system that was not designed to accommodate it, and the terrifying implication of that framing was immediate. When a foreign substance enters a system with no immunity against it, the system does not win. The system strains, the system fractures at the edges. Strange stood in his library with that understanding settling into him like cold water, and he did something the Sorcerer Supreme almost never did in the presence of an emerging threat. He stood still. Not from indecision, from the specific, rare, devastating experience of realizing that the first move he would normally make had already been made impossible. If you're enjoying this breakdown and you want more deep dive cosmic crossovers like this one, hit subscribe and the bell right now, because where this story goes next is somewhere none of us saw coming. Then a nervous fighter pilot scrambled from a carrier in the Atlantic following protocol, doing exactly what he had trained to do, locked targeting systems and fired. The missile struck the edge of Champa's divine aura and did not explode, did not deflect, did not even register as an event worth acknowledging. It dissolved, the way a snowflake dissolves when it touches something warm enough to make its existence briefly impossible. Champa looked down. His expression was not rage, not the contained ancient fury of a being preparing to make an example of something. It was something considerably worse. He looked mildly annoyed, the specific expression of a god who has been interrupted mid-thought about lunch by something he cannot quite believe was considered worth doing. Vados, without looking up from her drink, said very quietly and very pleasantly, "Perhaps, Lord Champa, a small demonstration." And in the silence that followed, the silence of a universe holding its breath above a planet that had just made eye contact with something it had no vocabulary to describe, the Marvel Universe discovered something it would spend the next 18 months trying to process. There are threats you can fight. There are threats you can contain. And then there are gods who look at your best response and feel inconvenienced. Stick around, because what happens in the next chapter, when Marvel's mightiest heroes actually try to stop him, is the moment this story stops being interesting and starts being humbling. Before we go any further, and I need you to stay with me here, because this is the part most what-if videos completely skip. You have to understand what Champa actually is, not as a fighter, not as a villain, as a function. Because the moment you understand his function, the moment you grasp what he represents at the structural level of his universe's operating system, every single thing that happens to Marvel over the next 7 days stops being a superhero story and starts being something much more unsettling. It starts being the story of a civilization discovering, in real time, that the framework it built its entire understanding of power on was always missing a variable, a big one, a purple, round, catastrophically irritable variable who is currently floating above Earth criticizing the cloud formations. In the cosmology of Universe 6, a god of destruction is not a title you earn. It is not a rank you achieve through conquest or cruelty or the accumulation of sufficient power. It is a role written into the operating code of the universe itself, where creation builds, destruction balances, where civilizations grow too stagnant, too corrupt, too cosmically overgrown for the health of the wider universal system, a god of destruction removes them, not out of malice, not out of ideology, out of function. The way a forest fire is not malicious, the way a flood does not hate what it erases. Champa does not destroy because he is evil. He destroys because that is what the universe assembled him to do, and that distinction between evil and functional is precisely what makes him so incompatible with every threat response system Marvel has ever built. Every single one of those systems was designed to stop evil. None of them were designed to argue with a natural law wearing a tracksuit. Now here is where Champa specifically becomes the nightmare scenario, because Russ, his twin brother, Universe 7's god of destruction, at least has edges. Beerus sleeps for decades between destructions. Beerus has Whis as his attendant and martial arts teacher, someone ancient enough and composed enough to occasionally redirect his worst impulses. Beerus carries, beneath his volatility, a thin but real layer of divine discipline. Champa has Vados. And while Vados is infinitely more powerful, infinitely more composed, and infinitely more intelligent than her employer, she has also, over several million years of service, developed what can only be described as a masterclass in strategic non-intervention. She does not stop Champa from doing catastrophic things. She simply watches, sips whatever she is drinking, and occasionally offers commentary so polite it sounds like a compliment and lands like a verdict. When Champa destroyed a civilization once for serving him cold food, Vados had noted, with genuine pleasantness, that their extinction had at least freed up some interesting real estate. Here is the thing that Sword's classification team spent an entire sleepless night trying to articulate and never quite managed. Every threat tier in their system was built on a shared assumption, that the threat in question came from within Marvel's universe. Thanos, native, Galactus, ancient constant of this very reality, operating on its physics, subject to its laws. Even the most reality-warping, universe-threatening forces Marvel had ever catalogued existed inside the jurisdiction of Marvel's cosmic order. Champa did not. He came from Universe 6, a completely separate cosmological system with different divine mathematics, different metaphysical architecture, different fundamental laws governing what power meant and how it behaved. He was not a bigger fish in Marvel's ocean. He was a fish from an entirely different ocean, currently sitting in Marvel's water, and Marvel's water had absolutely no biological framework to process him. The closest classification they landed on, after 14 hours of modeling, was Omega Divine Anomaly, category undefined, which, as one analyst said with the flat exhaustion of someone who had stopped being surprised by the Universe 3 career-changing incidents ago, was just a professional way of writing. We have no idea, we're scared, and we're hoping someone smarter than us figures this out. Doctor Strange was that someone smarter, and he was not having a better time than the analysts. He had been reaching across every mystical channel he possessed since the moment Champa's energy signature first made the Sanctum's deep frequency monitors produce a sound they had never produced before. Something between a warning tone and what Strange could only describe as the magical equivalent of a system saying, "This input is not recognized." Every entity he contacted gave him fragments that, assembled, pointed toward the same conclusion from every direction. Champa was not a demon, not a fallen deity, not a dimensional conqueror. He was a load-bearing element of a different universe's structural reality operating inside a universe that had no load-bearing position for him. And the implication of that framing hit Strange with the specific weight of an answer that explains everything and solves nothing. You cannot contain a load-bearing element of another reality using the legal frameworks of your own. It is not a question of power. It is a question of jurisdiction, and jurisdiction, as Strange was beginning to understand with cold, creeping clarity, was Marvel's actual problem here. Not strength, not strategy, jurisdiction. Meanwhile, Vados had taken it upon herself to conduct her own assessment of this universe, because Vados always conducted assessments. It was her nature. She had drifted, invisibly and entirely uninvited, through 3 layers of S.H.I.E.L.D.'s Moasum. Saint classified dimensional detection systems and found them charming in the way that antique furniture is charming, impressive for its era, completely non-functional for anything serious. She had briefly observed Doctor Strange's Sanctum Sanctorum from the exterior and made a mental note about the architectural inefficiency of using dimensional anchors as load-bearing structures. She had watched Tony Stark's HUD attempt to calculate Champa's power level and observed the moment it produced 3 question marks with the mild appreciation of someone watching a child attempt a very ambitious art project. None of this she reported to Champa because reporting it would require interacting with Champa, and Champa was currently engaged in the task of deciding whether Earth's sky was aesthetically acceptable or merely adequate, a deliberation he had been conducting for 45 minutes with the focused intensity he usually reserved for menus. Then Champa made a decision, not a destructive decision, not yet. A demonstrative one, which was, depending on your perspective, either slightly better or considerably worse. There was a moon. A perfectly ordinary moon, orbiting a gas giant at the far edge of the solar system, minding its own geological business in the way moons do. Champa looked at it, looked away, looked back, and then pointed at it with the specific energy of someone settling an argument with themselves. What happened next took less time than it takes to blink. The moon did not explode. It did not crack or fragment or dissipate in a visible shockwave. It simply stopped existing. One instant present, the next instant not, a before and after with no visible in-between, the way a word disappears when you erase it from a page. The energy released by that deletion registered simultaneously on every cosmic sensor in the Marvel galaxy. It registered on Asgard's deep observatories. It registered on the Kree Supreme Intelligence's probability matrices. It registered on instruments in the Shi'ar Empire that had not produced an alert in 600 years. And every single entity that received that reading understood the same thing in the same cold moment. That was him demonstrating restraint, the thing he was capable of when he was actually trying, when something genuinely irritated him, when his pride was challenged, when someone served him lukewarm food. That reading was not on any of their instruments, because that reading would have required instruments that didn't exist yet. Here is the part nobody in Marvel was ready to say out loud yet. And this is what the next chapter is about. When Earth's mightiest heroes actually assembled to respond to this, every single tier of their response failed. In order. Almost immediately. And the way it failed tells you everything about the gap between what Marvel thought it was capable of and what Champa's existence demonstrated it actually was. Don't go anywhere. 11 minutes. That is how long Marvel's tiered response protocol lasted before it became obvious. Not theoretically, not strategically, but viscerally, in the specific way that things become obvious when they are happening to you in real time. That the entire framework was built on an assumption Champa had already invalidated. The assumption was this: that a threat, however powerful, would behave like a threat, would engage, would escalate, would follow some recognizable pattern of aggression that Marvel's systems could read and respond to. Threats, in Marvel's experience, wanted things. Territory, power, worship, extinction, cosmic balance, whatever the ideology, there was always a direct ion to it, something to push back against. Champa did not want anything Marvel could address. He wanted to know if anyone on this planet had decent noodles, and you cannot build a tiered response protocol around that. Thor went first. Not because the protocol ordered it. The protocol at this point was mostly a series of increasingly alarmed question marks on various digital dashboards. He went first because something in his divine blood refused to stand still while a god sat in unchallenged sovereignty above a world he had sworn to protect. He ascended through the atmosphere with Mjolnir humming at a frequency that could shatter mountains, lightning trailing behind him like a declaration of intent, and he met Champa's gaze with the full ancestral weight of Asgardian royalty behind his eyes. He introduced himself the way Asgardians always did: title, lineage, the implicit statement that divinity in this universe was already occupied, thank you, and any newcomer would be wise to acknowledge the existing management. Champa looked at him. Vados, floating 3 feet to Champa's left, glanced at Thor with the polite, evaluating attention she gave to mildly interesting geological formations. Then Champa said, with the specific tone of someone who has just been told the restaurant is out of the dish they wanted, "You have lightning. That's cute. Does everyone here have a thing, or just you?" Thor, to his eternal credit, did not hesitate. He threw Mjolnir. It was a perfect throw. The kind of throw that had shattered the skulls of frost giants and cracked the armor of celestial soldiers, and once, famously, put a dent in something that Reed Richards had described as theoretically indestructible. It covered the distance between them in a fraction of a second. It struck Champa directly in the chest, and Champa looked down at the impact point with the expression of a man who has just been tapped on the shoulder by someone he doesn't recognize. He looked back up at Thor. He looked back down at his chest. "Your lightning," he said in a tone that was rapidly migrating from mildly curious to mildly irritated, "tastes like static electricity. I had a dessert prepared. It was going to be excellent. It now tastes like static electricity." He flicked one finger, The motion you use to remove a crumb from a tablecloth. Thor traveled approximately 400 miles and stopped only because Earth's curvature eventually got in the way. The crater he left in the Norwegian coastline was later measured at 63 meters deep. Captain Marvel got there before anyone else, which told you everything about her speed and nothing comforting about the situation. She pulled Thor from the crater in the Norwegian Sea while he was still processing what had just happened, and what she saw in his expression was something she had never seen there before in the full history of her knowing him. Not defeat. Thor had been defeated before. This was something quieter and more fundamental. It was the look of a man rewriting every assumption he has ever made about where he sits in the universal hierarchy. The specific, disorienting experience of a ceiling appearing above you where you previously believed there was open sky. "How hard did you hit him?" she asked. Thor looked at his hands. "With everything," he said. She looked up at the sky where Champa was still visible as a violet-gold distortion in the upper atmosphere, now apparently attempting to wave a shield Quinjet closer because he wanted to ask it something. "Okay," she said. "My turn." She did not announce herself. She did not invoke titles or heritage or the impressive list of things she had previously survived. She came in from the far side of the moon at near light speed, binary form blazing white gold, hitting him with the kind of force that had once cracked Kree, a warships in half like balsa wood. The impact registered on every seismic sensor in the solar system. In Sword's monitoring center, 3 different analysts made 3 different involuntary sounds of hope simultaneously. Because for one moment, one breathless fraction of a second, the energy readings shifted. Something happened. Then the readings stabilized. Champa moved approximately 2 feet to his left. He turned. He looked at her with the expression of someone who has just been interrupted mid-thought by a noise they cannot immediately identify. "Oh," he said, with the specific flatness of a being recalibrating its assessment of something it had initially underestimated to a level that was still, ultimately, not very high. "You're one of the strong ones." He said it the way you say it when you mean the opposite. Captain Marvel, who had punched through the barrier of binary power and come out the other side, felt those 5 words land like a formal notification. She did not retreat. She stopped advancing. There is a difference, and it matters, and she knew it. On the ground, in every city that still had functioning infrastructure, which was most of them because Champa hadn't technically done anything to the infrastructure yet, something was happening that the heroes were too occupied to monitor. 17 national governments had declared states of emergency within 6 hours. 3 had collapsed under the weight of mass evacuations that had no logical destination, because you cannot evacuate a planet when the thing you are evacuating from is sitting above the atmosphere. Sword's communication systems ran at 400% capacity and still couldn't process the volume of incoming data. And across every faith tradition on the planet, simultaneously, religious communities were doing what religious communities do when something appears in the sky that defies all existing explanation. They were reaching for the nearest available interpretive framework and fitting the event into it with the specific creative urgency of people who need the universe to make sense right now. Some called it judgment, some called it rapture, some called it a test. A new movement emerged within 48 hours that called it none of those things. That said simply, the universe is larger and stranger and more indifferent than any theology has ever been honest enough to admit. That movement grew fastest. People, it turned out, found a universe that didn't care about them somehow more believable than one that did. It wasn't comforting, but it felt true. And in a week like this one, true was what people were reaching for. Dr. Strange did not attempt direct engagement. He was too smart and too frightened for that, and in his case, those 2 things were the same. Instead, he spent those first hours doing something more dangerous than combat. He attempted understanding. He opened every mystical channel he had. He reached across dimensional barriers to entities whose age made Asgard look recently constructed. He pulled every text that addressed extra-jurisdictional divine forces, which turned out to be a very short reading list, because the concept had not previously been considered a practical concern. What came back was fragmented and consistent and deeply alarming. Champa was not an anomaly that had wandered into the wrong universe. He was a functional divine constant of a completely different cosmological system, operating inside Marvel's reality without being subject to Marvel's reality's rules, the way a song from one language does not follow the grammar of another language. Just because you're playing it in a different country, you can hear it. It affects the room. It does not become grammatically correct by virtue of being present. The laws of Marvel's universe were not broken by Champa's presence. They were simply irrelevant to him. And irrelevance, Strange was discovering, was a considerably harder problem than violation. Then came the moment that ended the first phase of Marvel's response and began something that nobody in any briefing room had a name for yet. A Kree observation cruiser, 700 meters of military engineering, 412 crew members operating on standard intelligence gathering protocols, moved too close. Not aggressively, not even particularly foolishly by the standards of the information they had available. They were doing their job, gathering data on an unprecedented cosmic anomaly, maintaining what their instruments told them was a safe observation distance. Champa noticed them the way you notice a fly that has landed in your peripheral vision. He glanced at the cruiser for less than a second. The cruiser folded. Not exploded, not disabled, not pushed away, but folded. Compressed into a geometry that the laws of physics governing this universe had previously considered theoretical, and then it ceased to exist. No debris field, no energy signature, no final transmission. 412 crew members gone from the universe in less time than it takes to draw a breath. The silence in every monitoring center that had been watching the feed was the specific silence of people trying to process something that their existing frameworks have no slot for. And then, from a sword analyst who had been awake for 18 hours staring at energy readings that didn't make sense, came the quiet observation that cut through every tactical discussion and every strategic calculation and landed in the room like the only true thing that had been said all week. This is not an invader. This is a cosmic correction waiting to happen. Nobody argued. Now, before we go any further, I want you to hold that line in your head. Because in the next chapter, the story stops being about Earth. It stops being about the Avengers. It expands to every corner of the Marvel galaxy. And when Galactus himself registers the anomaly and has to stop and recalculate, that is when you understand exactly how far above the existing ceiling Champa actually sits. Here is where the story gets bigger. And I mean that literally, because up until this point, everything we have covered has been happening in one location. Earth's atmosphere, Earth's orbit, Earth's heroes running tiered response protocols that collapsed in 11 minutes. But Champa's arrival was not just an Earth event. It was a galactic event, a cosmic event. The kind of event that makes empires go quiet and ancient forces stop what they are doing and look up. Because when something enters a universe that universe has no mathematical framework to process, when every sensor, every deep space relay, every divine observatory from here to the edge of the Marvel galaxy simultaneously registers an anomaly it cannot classify, the whole board reacts, not just the pieces on Earth's square, every piece, every empire, every abstract force, every ancient, incomprehensible, universe-sized intelligence that had been minding its own eternal business until this particular Tuesday arrived and made minding your own business suddenly feel irresponsible. So let us pull the camera back, way back, because what had happened out there, in the wider Marvel cosmos, is the part of this story that changes everything. The news reached Asgard as a tremor in the Odin force. Not a physical tremor. Asgard had weathered physical tremors that would have reduced solar systems to rubble and called it a mildly eventful afternoon. This was something older and more disturbing. A vibration in the metaphysical bedrock that connected Asgardian divine authority to the wider cosmic architecture of Marvel's universe. The Allfather's scholars recognized it within minutes and said nothing publicly, because what they recognized was not a warning they had language to comfortably transmit. The Odin force, that vast ancient reservoir of divine power that underwrote Asgard's claim to godhood across 9 realms and beyond, had flinched, not collapsed, not shattered, flinched, the way an ocean flinches when it detects a current moving beneath it from a direction it has never felt before. And oceans, in the experience of anyone who has lived near them long enough, do not flinch at things that are smaller than they are. Asgard began very quietly and with the specific efficiency of a civilization that had survived long enough to know that quiet preparation was the only kind that mattered to prepare. They did not announce it. Announcements require confidence in the nature of the threat. They did not have that. The Kree Supreme Intelligence received the full data package 12 hours after Champa's arrival. It ran its standard probability matrices, the same computational architecture that had modeled the outcomes of thousands of conflicts across centuries of tactical history. Normally, those matrices returned a range of outcomes with associated probability percentages, a spectrum of scenarios from best to worst with actionable recommendations embedded throughout. This time, every matrix returned the same result regardless of variable configuration. Not a range, not a spectrum, one answer, repeated across every simulation, every adjustment, every strategic modification the Supreme Intelligence applied. The answer was, in the clinical language of a system designed to be useful rather than comforting, no modeled scenario produces a successful direct opposition outcome. The Supreme Intelligence transmitted a single-line communique to every space-faring civilization it maintained diplomatic contact with. 4 words. Reclassify all threat tier assessments. No explanation, no elaboration. 4 words that rewrote every strategic defense calculation in the Marvel galaxy, because the Kree Supreme Intelligence did not issue messages like that casually. It issued them when the math stopped offering alternatives. Now, and this is the part I genuinely need you to appreciate, because this is where the power scaling community is going to have opinions in the comments. Let's talk about Galactus. Because Galactus became aware of Champa on the 3rd day, not through conventional detection. Galactus did not use conventional detection the way the sun does not use a lamp. He became aware the way truly ancient cosmic forces become aware of anomalies, through the texture of the universe itself changing around him. The Devourer of Worlds had consumed thousands of planets across billions of years. He had faced the living tribunal. He had been present at the birth of this universe and would, in his own deep cosmological calculus, be present somewhere near its end. He had a sense, not strategic, not emotional, but structurally functional, for the weight of things. And what he sensed in Champa's arrival was not a rival, not prey, something he had not encountered in his entire existence across the full span of Marvel's cosmic history. He sensed a phase, a reign constant, a load-bearing element of a different universe's equation, currently sitting inside his universe with no assigned position, no role in the local hierarchy, no relationship to any of the mathematical principles that governed how power was supposed to behave in this reality. Galactus processed this for approximately 6 hours. Then he began moving toward the solar system, not charging, not attacking, investigating, which was, for anyone familiar with Galactus, somehow more concerning than the alternative. Meanwhile, back in Earth's upper atmosphere, Champa had reached a conclusion about the planet below that was significantly less cosmological and significantly more personal. The conclusion was this: the food had potential, but the service was unacceptable. He had made one reasonable request, one simple, entirely non-threatening inquiry about the best available cuisine on the planet, and 7 days later the response had been missiles, a hammer, a very fast woman in a glowing suit, and enough surveillance drones to constitute a genuine aesthetic nuisance. Vados, reading his expression with the practiced accuracy of someone who had been doing so for several million years, decided that now was an appropriate moment to intervene diplomatically before Champa reached the specific threshold of petty irritation that historically preceded the deletion of a hemisphere. She descended to Earth's surface, invisibly, effortlessly, through 3 layers of SWORD's most sophisticated detection systems that registered her passage approximately the same way a screen door registers a change in wind direction. She located the office of SWORD Director Abigail Brand, materialized in the chair across from Brand's desk, and said, with impeccable pleasantness, "My employer would like to speak with someone about the quality of your planet's cuisine. I would suggest treating this as your highest current diplomatic priority." Brand looked at her, looked at the chair she had appeared in from nowhere, looked back at her. "How did you get through our—" "Your security infrastructure is charming," Vados said warmly. "Genuinely, for its era. The result of Vados's diplomatic intervention was the most unusual convoy in the history of human civilization. A Shield Quinjet carrying 6 of the most accomplished chefs on Earth, one extremely nervous UN liaison, and an assortment of the planet's finest prepared foods, ascending through the atmosphere toward a god of destruction who was, at this precise moment, complaining loudly to no one in particular that the clouds on this planet were arranged in a deeply uninspiring way. Vados guided the Quinjet into position with the serene efficiency of someone parking a car. Champa looked at the food. He picked up something. He chewed. The assembled heroes, watching the sensor feeds from every available angle, held their collective breath. Then Champa made a sound. Not an explosion, not a declaration of war, a sound of moderate approval. The specific sound of someone who had expected adequate and received good. "The bread," he said, gesturing at what was, technically, a brioche. "More of this." Vados smiled pleasantly. The UN liaison, who had prepared 12 contingency statements for this meeting, put all 12 of them away and asked with the specific adaptability of a diplomat who had learned to work with what the universe actually gave him rather than what he had prepared for, whether Lord Champa had any other dietary preferences they should be aware of. This was, without question, the most successful diplomatic exchange in the post-Champa period. It was also, as Dr. Strange noted privately, the most terrifying, because it demonstrated that Marvel's greatest strategic asset in this situation was not Thor's hammer or Strange's sorcery or Tony Stark's engineering. It was croissants. And civilizations that depend on croissants for their survival were operating on a considerably narrower margin than anyone preferred to acknowledge. The comparison that circulated through every briefing room, every war council, every mystical conclave, and every Shi'ar imperial committee convened to assess the situation was always the same, and always inadequate. Thanos had needed the Infinity Gauntlet. Galactus followed a consumption cycle governed by necessity. Kang required centuries of preparation. Every universe-threatening force Marvel had cataloged operated on borrowed power, collected artifacts, constructed ideologies, or ancient cycles that could, in theory, be interrupted. Champa required none of that scaffolding. His destructive capacity was not borrowed or assembled or channeled through external instruments. It was constitutional, built into what he was at the most fundamental level of his existence, the way heat is built into fire rather than added to it afterward. And here is the detail that the Illuminati, Reed Richards, Tony Stark, Dr. Strange, Black Bolt, Namor, Charles Xavier, assembled in an emergency session that lasted 9 hours, kept arriving at and kept refusing to say out loud until Strange finally said it in the 4th hour because the room needed someone to say it. Champa is not at the top of his own hierarchy. He answers to Vados, who is more powerful. Vados answers to the Grand Priest. The Grand Priest answers to Zeno, the Omni-King, a being of such absolute and cheerful destructive capacity that even gods of destruction treat his name with reverence. The being currently eating brioche above Earth's atmosphere and complaining about the cloud arrangements was, in the hierarchy of his own cosmology, middle management. The room went very quiet after Strange said that. Tony Stark stared at the ceiling for a long time. Then he said, "I need a drink." Reed Richards said, "I need several." Black Bolt said nothing, which was both his nature and, in this context, the most expressive thing anyone in the room communicated. By the end of the first week, the Marvel Universe had reached a conclusion it should have reached in the first hour, but had spent 7 days and considerable resources arriving at through every possible alternative route first. There was no victory condition. Not for Earth's heroes, not for the galactic empires, not for the cosmic abstracts who were now registering Champa's presence with the wary, recalibrating attention of entities that had believed, until approximately 72 hours ago, that they had a comprehensive understanding of the power ceiling of their universe. The living universe had metabolized this truth at different speeds across different layers of its population. Generals first, then scientists, then philosophers, then ordinary people, then heroes last of all, because heroes were by definition the beings most constitutionally committed to the belief that every problem had a solution if you hit it hard enough or thought about it cleverly enough. But the universe had stopped maintaining that fiction on their behalf. There was no solution to Champa. There was only the question of what it cost to survive him. And in the next chapter, the one where Galactus finally arrives, where Marvel's absolute best assembles for one last stand, where the Scarlet Witch attempts something that has no name in any magical tradition, you are going to find out that the cost was considerably higher than anyone had budgeted for. And that survival, when it finally came, looked nothing like what anyone had been trained to call a victory. 7 days. 7 days of watching. Me, azuring, modeling, philosophizing, and arriving at conclusions that all pointed toward the same unbearable answer. 7 days of Champa drifting through Earth's upper atmosphere, occasionally deleting things by accident, rating the planet's sunsets with the mild approval of a tourist who had expected less, and requesting increasingly specific variations of bread from a rotating convoy of increasingly terrified chefs. And somehow, it was the mildness that finally broke the dam. Because there is a specific kind of unbearable that comes not from active destruction, but from divine indifference. The universe could process an enemy. It had protocols for enemies. What it could not process, what none of Marvel's assembled intelligence, heroism, and cosmic authority had a single framework for, was being irrelevant to one. And on the morning of Day 7, in a sword monitoring center that smelled of cold coffee and accumulated existential dread, someone made a decision. Not a strategic decision, not a calculated one. The kind of decision that gets made when doing nothing has finally become more psychologically unbearable than doing something you know probably won't work. Thor came back first. That was not surprising. What was surprising was how he came back. Not with Mjolnir raised, not with lightning already splitting the sky and the declaration of a being who has decided that battle is the answer regardless of what the question is. He came back quietly. He ascended through the atmosphere with something heavier than battle fury in his bearing, something that people who knew Thor well would have recognized as the specific weight of a man who has spent 7 days thinking about a question he has never had to think about before. The question was this: what is a god? Not rhetorically, not philosophically in the comfortable, academic way that philosophers ask it from the safety of a distance. Practically, urgently, in the specific way you ask a question when the answer has direct and immediate consequences for everything you thought you knew about yourself. Thor had grown up understanding godhood as a relationship, between power and the responsibility that power generated, between divine authority and the realms that authority was meant to protect. Champa's existence did not fit that understanding. Champa's existence suggested that divinity, at its most fundamental level, was simply scale. And that scale, past a certain point, became indistinguishable from weather. You did not negotiate with weather. You did not challenge weather to single combat. You either got out of the way, or you got wet. Thor had spent 7 days deciding which kind of god he wanted to be in the face of that knowledge. He arrived back at the fight because he had decided that the answer to that question could not be found from the ground. The assembly came together in 4 hours. 4 hours. Which was, by any objective measure, the most coordinated multi-faction mobilization in Marvel's recorded history. Thor and Captain Marvel anchored the physical tier. The Silver Surfer positioned himself at the outer edge of the solar system as a cosmic relay, his connection to the power cosmic giving him a sensitivity to universal fluctuations that no mechanical sensor could replicate, his presence serving as an early warning system for whatever Champa decided to do with the energy he was visibly, casually, continuously radiating just by existing. Tony Stark ran coordination from a reinforced orbital platform he had assembled in 36 hours because Tony Stark's response to impossible situations was always to build something, and building something was at least a form of action even when the thing you were building could not ultimately address the problem. Doctor Strange opened 7 simultaneous dimensional channels, each one designed to probe a different aspect of Champa's metaphysical footprint in Marvel's reality, and the Scarlet Witch, called from seclusion by a personal request from Strange that had taken him considerable courage to make, positioned herself at a probability nexus at the edge of Earth's atmosphere, preparing to attempt something that had no clean name in any mystical tradition ever recorded. Not an attack, not a containment, a suggestion to the fabric of existence itself that this being's presence was structurally incompatible with Marvel's universal order. Strange had described it to her privately as the metaphysical equivalent of asking the ocean to reconsider a wave. She had said, "I've done harder things." He had not argued because she was right and because he needed her to believe it. Vados noticed the assembly before Champa did, because Vados noticed everything before Champa did. She observed the formation with the same serene, evaluating attention she brought to all things, cataloged its components with the practiced efficiency of someone who had assessed combat formations for several million years, and arrived at her assessment in approximately 3 seconds. Then she looked at Champa, who was currently engaged in a detailed and animated discussion with the SHIELD Quinjet pilot about whether the croissants from the morning convoy had been slightly less buttery than the previous day's batch, and decided not to mention the assembly. Champa would notice it eventually. He always did, and the gap between when he noticed things and when he decided they required a response was, historically, the most dangerous interval in any situation involving him, because it was the interval during which his mood, rather than any external factor, determined outcomes. She sipped her drink. She waited. Champa noticed on the 6th minute. He turned from the Quinjet pilot, who had been maintaining the structural integrity of this conversation through sheer professionalism and what could only be described as the deepest commitment to duty in the history of aviation, and looked at the formation assembled around him with the expression of a man who has sat down in a restaurant and discovered that someone has rearranged the furniture while he was in the bathroom. "What?" he said, in the tone that Vados recognized as the precise precursor to either a tantrum or a destruction event, depending on what happened in the next 30 seconds. "Is all of this?" Nobody answered immediately. The formation held. And in the silence of that held formation, with the full weight of Marvel's assembled response hanging in the atmosphere around a being who found it mildly irritating, the Scarlet Witch expanded her probability wave. It was extraordinary. That is the only word for it. Not as a compliment, not as a comfort, but as an objective assessment of what Wanda Maximoff achieved in that moment with the full, focused, reality-warping weight of her power directed at a single target. The Hex probability wave expanded outward and upward, washing through the dimensional layers of Champa's divine presence with a pressure that bent light at its edges, made every sensitive being within 3 solar systems simultaneously nauseous, and caused Vados, who had not visibly reacted to anything in the entire 7 days, to look up from her drink with an expression of what could only be described as genuine interest. For 3 seconds, 3 extraordinary, breathless, history-making seconds, Champa's divine aura flickered. Not dramatically, not in any way that suggested damage or meaningful suppression, like a candle touched by wind, but it flickered, and every hero in that formation felt the same. Dangerous, irrational, completely understandable emotions surged through their tactical calculations simultaneously. Hope. 3 seconds of hope. The most expensive 3 seconds in the history of Marvel's universe. Then Champa blinked. He looked at the Scarlet Witch with an expression that moved, in real time and with visible stages, from surprise through confusion, through something that landed ultimately in the specific register of an emotion that Vados had only seen on his face approximately 4 times in several million years of service. Respect. Not admiration. Not warmth. The cold, involuntary respect that a being of absolute power produces when something manages to register on it against all reasonable expectation. He looked at Wanda the way a mountain might look at a very determined chisel. Briefly, genuinely impressed that the chisel existed, and then proceeding to be a mountain. He pressed back. Not with rage, not with a targeted attack, with weight. A simple, almost casual outward pulse of Hakai energy. The divine destruction force that was as natural to him as breathing, radiating from his presence the way heat radiates from a star when it stops bothering to contain itself. The pulse was not aimed. It was ambient. It was what happened when a god of destruction stopped managing his baseline output. And it hit the assembled formation like physics being briefly renegotiated. Captain Marvel absorbed as much as she could and was still thrown back across the curvature of Earth. Thor caught himself in the upper atmosphere with a grip of lightning that took everything he had, and felt every structure in his divine body register the impact the way a tuning fork registers a strike. Completely, resonantly, with no possibility of pretending it hadn't happened. The Silver Surfer's cosmic connection to the universal substrate flickered and destabilized for 4 seconds. NDS, which in the Silver Surfer's experience was the equivalent of a normal being experiencing a full sensory blackout. The 7-dimensional channels Strange had opened collapsed simultaneously. Not disrupted, not redirected, collapsed. Each one snapping shut like a door meeting a hurricane. And the Scarlet Witch's probability nexus shattered into fragments of unraveled possibility that Strange spent the next hour carefully reassembling before they caused secondary cascade damage to the local reality. The stand had lasted 90 seconds. It had achieved exactly one demonstrable result, revealing with scientific precision the exact and breathtaking scale of the gap between what Marvel could bring to bear and what Champa represented at the level of fundamental divine mechanics. And into the silence of that revelation, into the specific quiet of a universe that has just been shown something it cannot argue with, came the sound of ancient engines moving through space. Galactus had arrived. He materialized at the edge of the solar system with the specific gravity of a being for whom arrival was a geological event rather than a movement. Enormous, ancient, radiating the particular quality of presence that belonged only to things that had existed since before this universe had a name for itself. And he looked at Champa. And Champa, in the middle of dusting off his divine sash with the mild irritation of someone who has just had their outfit disturbed by someone else's battle, looked back. 2 cosmic forces, each one incomprehensible by any mortal standard, regarding each other across the distance of a solar system with the quality of attention that passes between beings who are deciding what category to file each other under. Every censor, every hero, every empire watching held everything it had. Then Galactus spoke, not in sound, but in the bone-deep frequency that mortals experienced as vibration rather than hearing. And what he communicated was not a challenge, not a greeting, but an acknowledgement. One ancient force recognizing another, noting the difference in their origins, conveying in the compressed language of beings for whom words were an inefficient but occasionally necessary tool, one essential observation: you are not from the mathematics of this universe. Champa's response was immediate and entirely characteristic. He shrugged. The shrug released a pulse of energy that resculpted 3 asteroid clusters and caused Galactus, for the first time in the recorded history of the Marvel Universe, to take one single step backward. Not in fear, in recalculation. And if you understand what it means for Galactus to recalculate, if you understand what category of thing produces a recalculation in a being that has faced the living tribunal and survived the death of a previous universe, then you understand exactly what that one step backward communicated to every civilization watching it happen. The ceiling had moved again. It had moved considerably, and what came after that step, the moment that ended the climax and began something nobody in Marvel had a word for yet, is the part of this story that keeps me up at night. Because Marvel survived. But the reason it survived is not the reason anyone was hoping for, and that reason changes everything. He left the way he arrived. No ceremony, no declaration, no courtesy of a warning that would have allowed the universe to brace itself, to exhale on its own terms, to mark the moment with any kind of intentional punctuation. One instant the violet gold haze was bending light across Earth's upper atmosphere, his divine presence registering simultaneously on every cosmic scale from here to the edge of the Marvel galaxy. A reading so consistent, so pervasive, so woven into the background radiation of the past 7 days that it had begun to feel, to every sensor and every mystic and every being sensitive enough to perceive it, less like an intrusion and more like a new feature of reality. And then, between one breath and the next, it was simply gone. Not faded, not retreated, gone. The absolute, immediate, total absence of something that had been enormous, the way a sound stops mid-note rather than trailing into silence. Sword's sensors, screaming at 400% capacity for 7 consecutive days, went quiet so suddenly that 3 separate analysts assumed catastrophic system failure and spent 4 minutes running diagnostics before accepting that the readings were accurate. The sensors were fine. Champa had just left. No explanation, no goodbye. No final demonstration of power or parting observation about the cloud arrangements. He had eaten the last of the brioche, looked at Earth for approximately 30 seconds with an expression that Vados declined to translate for anyone, and then departed the way genuinely powerful things always depart, without asking the universe's permission. The physical accounting was extensive. 3 communication satellite networks destroyed. 1 Kree observation cruiser gone with all 412 crew members. Gone not in the way things died in this universe, but in a way that death itself, as Strange would later discover through channels he did not discuss publicly, could not account for or locate. A Norwegian coastline reshaped by the shockwave of Thor's involuntary departure. Atmospheric distortions that would take months to fully normalize across 3 continental weather systems. Ecosystems disrupted along ocean shelves that had been stable for 40 million years. The physical damage filled 17 volumes of post-incident documentation and kept multiple scientific committees occupied for the better part of a year. It was real damage, significant damage. The kind of damage that, in any previous context, would have been classified as one of the worst events in Marvel's recorded history. And well, yet, and this is the part that haunted every analyst who worked through those 17 volumes, this was the damage caused by a god of destruction who had been relaxed, who had been, by his own standards, in a good mood. The number that appeared in the margins of every report, unwritten but present in every calculation, was the one nobody wanted to formalize. The estimated damage threshold if he had been annoyed. Nobody wrote it down. They all knew it. Writing it down would have made it more real than anyone was currently prepared for it to be. The heroes processed it the way they processed everything, in ways that reflected, with uncomfortable precision, who each of them was when the performance of heroism stopped being available as a coping mechanism. Captain Marvel threw herself into physical reconstruction with the focused intensity of someone who needed her hands occupied because her mind was doing something she hadn't authorized it to do. Replaying those 3 seconds of Wanda's probability wave, flickering his aura, running the scenario on a loop, asking the same question from 17 different angles. What if the timing had been different? What if the formation had been configured differently? What if Strange's dimensional channels had been opened before the confrontation rather than during it? She never arrived at a satisfying answer because the satisfying answer did not exist. And part of her, the part that had been doing this long enough to recognize when a problem was genuinely insoluble versus merely very difficult, already knew that. She kept asking anyway, because stopping meant accepting the answer she already had. And the answer she already had was not one that a person who had dedicated their existence to protecting things found easy to live inside. Thor went back to Asgard and sat in the observatory that Heimdall had once used to watch all of existence, and he stared at the coordinates where Champa had been for 6 hours before speaking to anyone. What he said when he finally spoke was not what his companions had expected. They had prepared, with the specific caring pragmatism of people who knew Thor well, for the version of him that expressed grief through battle readiness, that processed defeat by immediately planning the next engagement, that converted existential uncertainty into tactical momentum, because that was the architecture his culture had given him for managing hard things. Instead, he sat in Heimdall's old chair and he said, quietly, and with the particular stillness of someone who has arrived at a thought that has been waiting for them for a very long time, I need to understand what a god actually is, not rhetorically, not as a prelude to action, as a genuine inquiry, the most honest question he had asked in several centuries of existence. The people who heard it were, most of them, more frightened by it than by anything Champa had done. Because Thor asking what a god was meant, Thor had stopped being certain he knew. And a Thor who wasn't certain about that was navigating without the instrument he had relied on most. Dr. Strange wrote nothing down. Every instinct in his training pushed toward documentation. The sorcerer's fundamental reflex of capturing knowledge before the incomprehensible dissolved back into its natural state of being unprocessable. But he found, sitting with the full weight of what Champa's presence had touched in the architecture of this universe's metaphysical reality, That some knowledge resisted documentation, not because it was too complex to describe, but because describing it would make it smaller than it actually was. What Strange had pressed his hands against, in those hours of mystical analysis and dimensional probing, what he had felt push back, was the edge of his universe's self-understanding, the boundary beyond which Marvel's entire accumulated wisdom about the nature of reality simply stopped being a map and became a wall. He had stood at that wall, he had felt its texture, and he understood, with the quiet, permanent clarity that certain experiences produce rather than teaching, that the wall was not the end of the territory. It was the end of the map. The territory continued. He did not write it down. He carried it instead, the way certain knowledge has to be carried, not as information that can be retrieved and used, but as weight, as a permanent recalibration of every subsequent thought about how large the universe was relative to every previous estimate. The civilian response was, in its own quietly extraordinary way, the most honest thing that happened in the entire post-Champa period, and I mean that genuinely, not as a rhetorical device. While the heroes processed through their specific and individual frameworks of grief and recalibration, while the governments convened committees and the scientists ran models and the mystics consulted traditions that turned out to be insufficient, but tried anyway, the ordinary people on the ground were doing what ordinary people do when the universe demonstrates its indifference at scale. They were adapting, not to safety. Safety was not currently on offer, and everyone understood that implicitly. But to the fact of what had happened, to the reality of a universe that was larger and stranger and less organized around their survival than their previous operating assumptions had allowed for. And adaptation, when it is genuine rather than performed, produces things that are sometimes more valuable than any strategic response. A bakery in Lyon became briefly the most photographed building in Europe because its owner, a 63-year-old woman named Marguerite, who had survived 2 previous near-apocalypses with the same unimpressed practicality and had decided that a third was not going to change her morning routine, had taped a handwritten note to her door during the 7 days. It read in French, "God of destruction, please try our croissants before any decisions are made." She gave one interview to one journalist who asked about its cultural resonance. She said, "I put it there because it was true. If something that powerful comes to your street, you offer what you have. That is just manners." The interview was translated into 47 languages. It became, in ways that no diplomat or strategist or cosmic entity had managed, the most widely distributed, honest communication produced in the entire event. The deeper question, the one that lived not in the damage reports or the political commissions or the philosophical texts beginning to circulate in the months following Champa's departure, but in the private, unperformed thoughts of every being who had been close enough to feel the reality of what had visited, was the one nobody had language for yet. Not what happened, what it meant. What it meant that the universe had been visited by something whose existence was not an anomaly or a mistake or a villain's gambit, but a function, a built-in feature of a different reality's design, and had been found by that function to be mildly entertaining and then mildly boring. What it meant that survival had not been earned through strength or sacrifice or cleverness or the specific, extraordinary qualities that Marvel's heroes had demonstrated across decades of impossible situations. What it meant that survival had arrived in the end as a consequence of appetite. Champa had eaten well. He had found the brioche adequate. He had decided the cloud arrangements were uninspiring, and on the basis of those assessments, those deeply, absurdly personal divine assessments, 400 billion lives had continued rather than ceased. That was not a victory. That was not even luck in the conventional sense. That was something that required a new word entirely, a word for the specific condition of continuing to exist, because the thing capable of ending you happened to be in a decent mood, happened to find your food acceptable, happened to have somewhere else to be. Marvel did not have that word yet. It would spend the next year trying to find it. And in the next chapter, when the living tribunal convenes the most significant cosmic assembly in the history of this universe, when death itself reveals something about those 412 missing Kree crew members that nobody was prepared for, the search for that word is going to get considerably more urgent. 3 months after Champa's departure, the living tribunal convened. Now, if you know Marvel cosmology, you know what that means. The living tribunal does not convene. It arbitrates. It adjudicates. It responds to petitions from cosmic entities the way a Supreme Court responds to cases, with the measured, absolute authority of the highest judicial power in the universe, operating from a position of comprehensive jurisdictional confidence. It does not call meetings. It does not summon witnesses. It does not gather the abstract constants of the universe into a single metaphysical space and ask them a question. Except, for the first time in the recorded history of Marvel's cosmic order, it did exactly that. It called every abstract entity, every cosmic constant, every universe-sized intelligence that constituted the living architecture of Marvel's reality into a single convening, eternity, infinite, death, oblivion, the Celestials, Galactus, all of them, assembled. And the question the living tribunal asked them, translated from the compressed pre-linguistic communication format that beings of their scale used into something approximating words, was 4 syllables that landed in that assembly like a stone dropped from a very great height into very still water. Not a tactical question, not a strategic one, simply, "Did any of you know?" The silence that followed was the most significant silence in the history of this universe. Because silence, from beings whose collective knowledge spanned the entirety of Marvel's cosmic history across every timeline and every dimensional variant that had ever existed, was not ignorance. It was acknowledgement. And acknowledgement from these beings about this question meant something that nobody at any lower level of Marvel's cosmic hierarchy had yet been willing to say in plain language. Eternity answered first. And I want you to understand what eternity actually is before I tell you what it said, because the answer only lands correctly if you have the context. Eternity is not a god in Marvel's cosmology. It is not an entity in the way that Galactus or the Celestials are entities, beings of enormous power that nonetheless exist within the universe as distinct presences. Eternity is the universe. It is the living consciousness of Marvel's entire universal existence. Every star, every dimension, every particle and wave and probability and timeline that constitutes the total sum of this reality, organized into a single, incomprehensible awareness. When eternity speaks, it is the universe speaking about itself, and what eternity communicated in that convening, in the direct pre-linguistic format that these beings used when they were being honest rather than diplomatic, was this. It had felt Champa's arrival. Had felt it the way a living body feels a foreign object enter it, not necessarily as pain, but as the profound biological wrongness of something present that does not belong to the system it is moving through. And what eternity had done with that feeling during the 7 days of Champa's presence was nothing. Not from lack of power, not from strategic restraint. Because it had reached, in its vast and ancient self-understanding, the same conclusion Strange's analysis had produced from the opposite direction. Champa existed outside the framework of Marvel's universal law, and attempting to apply that law to him would be the equivalent of trying to adjudicate a foreign national under a legal system they had never agreed to and were not subject to. The law was not wrong. The jurisdiction simply did not extend that far. Then death contributed something. And death's contribution was the one that made the assembled entities go still in a way that eternity's acknowledgement had not. Because death, in Marvel's cosmology, is comprehensive. Everything that ends in death's domain. Every civilization, every star, every abstract entity that has ever ceased, they are all, in some metaphysical sense, accounted for in death's vast and ancient ledger. Death does not lose things. Death is, by definition, where things go when they stop being elsewhere, and what death communicated in that convening was a specific and devastating gap in its ledger. The 412 Kree crew members who had been folded out of existence by 1 second of Champa's casual attention, they were not there. Not in Death's realm. Not in any realm that Death could locate, access, or even detect from its position within Marvel's metaphysical architecture. They were not dead in any sense that Marvel's universe understood the word. They were not in transition, not in any afterlife, not in any dimensional pocket or temporal anom, ali that Death's comprehensive awareness could reach. They were simply absolutely irreversibly elsewhere, removed not just from life, but from the entire metaphysical continuity of Marvel's existence, existing in some state or non-state that was as far outside death's jurisdiction as Champa himself was outside the living tribunals. Death, the most comprehensive and absolute constant in Marvel's universe, had a gap in its ledger. 412 entries that should have been there and were not, and every entity in that convening understood what that gap meant, because it meant only one thing. Champa's Hakai energy did not kill things in any sense Marvel's death had authority over. It removed them from the equation entirely, not ended, erased. And there is a difference between those two things, that is, cosmologically speaking, the difference between a sentence that ends with a period and a sentence that someone reaches into the page and physically removes from the document. Death went very still after communicating this, the kind of still that, in a being who was the embodiment of all ending, felt less like composure and more like the specific quiet of something encountering its own limit for the first time. The Celestials delivered the most structurally significant information in the most characteristically celestial way, which is to say with the total absence of emotional inflection, delivered in pure data, with the specific quality of emphasis that Celestials used when they wanted to ensure something was not underestimated. What they had recorded, through observational systems operating at the most fundamental level of Marvel's informational substrate, beneath the physics, beneath the metaphysics, in the deep code of the universe's own operating reality, was this. During the 7 days of Champa's presence, the foundational mathematical substrate of Marvel's universe had been altered, not damaged, not core, upted, altered. The insertion, at the deepest available level of the universe's operating reality, of mathematical principles that did not originate from Marvel's own cosmic genesis. Fragments of Universe 6's divine mathematics, bleeding from Champa's presence into the bedrock of a reality that had been built entirely from different numbers. The Celestials quantified this contamination at 0.003% of the universe's total informational volume. They noted, and here is the part that made the living tribunal sit with the data for 3 weeks before responding, that this percentage would not decrease on its own over time. It would compound. Foreign mathematics, once introduced into a foundational substrate, did not dilute. They propagated. They multiplied against the native equations, producing hybrid outcomes at an exponentially increasing rate. The universe had been changed at its deepest level, not broken, not destroyed, rewritten in its most fundamental layer in ways that would take centuries to manifest and longer than that to fully comprehend. Dr. Strange learned about the compounding contamination through the indirect channels his position afforded him, channels he declined to specify publicly, which meant they were either embarrassing, terrifying, or both. He sat with the data for 2 days before doing anything else with it. Not from paralysis. Strange had moved past paralysis in his first year as Sorcerer Supreme and had not returned to it since. From the specific, careful deliberation of a man who understood that the way you first describe a problem shapes every subsequent attempt to address it, and that describing this problem incorrectly would be considerably more dangerous than describing it late. What he eventually arrived at was this. 0.003% of a universe's foundational mathematics was, in absolute terms, an almost incomprehensibly large volume of altered reality. The universe was not a small document. Every fraction of a percent of its total informational volume represented physical, metaphysical, and dimensional space that dwarfed anything mortal or even most cosmic minds could model. The contamination was already, in absolute terms, larger than most threats Marvel had ever faced, and it was growing, quietly, in the dark mathematics beneath everything, producing, in its compounding, outcomes that Strange's most sophisticated modeling could not predict with any reliability. New edges in the fabric of possibility, new vulnerabilities in the local physics, new capabilities in being sensitive enough to feel the foreign equations beginning to surface. He did not publish this analysis. He kept it, and the weight of it, and the specific nightmares it produced, entirely to himself, for a while. The Silver Surfer came to Strange 3 weeks after the convening, which told Strange that the Surfer had access to the same information through his connection to the power cosmic. and that he had also spent 3 weeks deciding how to discuss it before arriving. They sat together in the Sanctum Sanctorum's library for 4 hours. The conversation was, by the standards of most conversations, extraordinarily quiet. Two beings who had both pressed their understanding against the same wall from different directions and found it immovable, sitting with the shared experience of that immovability without pretending it was something else. At one point, the surfer said with the specific, weary honesty of a being who had served Galactus long enough to have a comprehensive understanding of what cosmic scale actually meant. "We have been fortunate, but fortune and survival are not the same thing, and we have been treating them as synonyms." Strange looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "I know." 2 words. Everything necessary. Nothing comforting. The surfer left without resolving anything, which was the only honest way the conversation could have ended. The heroes were not present at the cosmic convening. They learned of it afterward through the layers of cosmic information that filtered down from abstract to galactic to interplanetary to planetary, each layer translating it into terms appropriate to its own scale, so that by the time it reached the Avengers it had been compressed into something that fit inside human cognitive architecture without shattering it. Tony Stark received the summary from the Silver Surfer directly, because the surfer had decided, with the specific moral clarity of someone who had spent too long in the service of appetite and was now constitutionally committed to honesty, that the people defending this universe deserved to know what they were defending it inside of. Tony sat with the information for 6 hours. Then he said, to no one in particular, in the empty lab where he had retreated to think in the way he always retreated to think, surrounded by half-built things, which was where he felt most capable, and which today felt, for the first time he could remember, slightly hollow. So the universe just got permanent homework from a bored god, the cosmic equivalent of a Supreme Court, admitted it has no jurisdiction over the problem. Death itself has a gap in its ledger, and the foundational math of reality is being quietly rewritten from the basement up. He paused. He looked at the holographic projections surrounding him. And we survived because the food was good. He turned off the projections. He sat in the dark for a while, then he turned them back on. Because Tony Stark, whatever else was true about him, did not sit in the dark for long. He had never found it useful. And useful was, in the end, the only category he knew how to work in. The question of what useful meant in a universe whose foundational mathematics were being permanently rewritten by the residual presence of a being nobody could stop. That question sat at the center of everything that came next. And in the next chapter, when the first physical manifestations of the contamination begin surfacing in places nobody expected, when something new appears deep beneath Wakanda that Reed Richards cannot explain and Charles Xavier cannot read, the homework Champa left behind starts turning in its own answers, whether Marvel was ready for those answers or not. 6 months after Champa left, a child in Mumbai drew a picture that became, without anyone planning or intending it, the defining cultural artifact of the post-Champa era. She was 7 years old. She had spent the 7 days of his presence watching the violet gold light bend through her bedroom window while her parents held each other in the kitchen and whispered in the careful, compressed tones that adults use when they are frightened and do not want their children to understand how frightened. She had not been frightened. She had been, in the specific way that very young children sometimes are when confronted with something too large for their existing framework to classify, simply curious. She drew what she had seen. The light, the shape she had glimpsed through the atmospheric distortion, the sense of enormous weight pressing gently on the sky the way a hand presses gently on a table to check if it's stable. Then she drew, next to it, a small figure with its hand raised. Not in threat, not in supplication, in greeting. She titled the picture, in careful block letters across the bottom of the page, "Hello, God." Her teacher sent it to a local newspaper. Within 3 weeks, it had been reproduced in 42 countries. Within 2 months, it was mounted on the wall of the United Nations General Assembly chamber, placed there by a Secretary General who said, in the speech accompanying its installation, that it was the most honest diplomatic document produced in the history of the organization. Nobody argued. Picard. See, when you strip away every strategic framework, every cosmic analysis, every 17-volume damage assessment, That picture was the only response to Champa's visit that had gotten the tone exactly right. "Hello, we see you. We don't understand you, but we're still here, and we're still reaching toward the things we don't understand." That was ultimately the most honest thing the Marvel Universe had to offer, and it turned out to be, for the moment, enough. Now, and this is the part where things get genuinely strange, and I need you to stay with me because this is where the foreign variable contamination stops being a theoretical concept and starts being a Tuesday morning problem. Let me tell you what Reed Richards found beneath Wakanda. 6 months post-Champa, a geological survey team working at a depth of approximately 4 kilometers below Wakanda's northern shelf encountered something that their instruments classified, after considerable confused deliberation, as a metallic ore deposit. This was not by itself unusual. Wakanda's geological history was extraordinarily rich and had been producing surprises for as long as anyone had been looking. What was unusual was the specific properties of this deposit. It was denser than vibranium, not slightly denser, significantly denser, in ways that Reed's most sophisticated modeling framework could not account for using any element or compound native to Marvel's known periodic table. It absorbed and redirected energy with an efficiency that exceeded vibranium by an order of magnitude. And when T'Challa brought a sample to Reed, and Reed spent 48 straight hours running every analysis available to him, what he eventually communicated, with the specific expression of a man who has arrived at an answer that raises 17 new questions for everyone it resolves, was this: the molecular structure of the Ordis. I'd not match any naturally occurring process in Marvel's universe. It matched, in its deep mathematical architecture, the Kachin material that the Celestials had recorded traces of in the foreign variable contamination data. Universe 6's hardest substance, spontaneously manifesting in the geological substrate of Earth 616. The contamination was no longer just theoretical, it was physical, it was under their feet, and it was, at the rate of the compounding mathematics, only the beginning. Charles Xavier found the second manifestation before Reed found the first, which told you everything about the respective speeds of geological discovery versus psychic detection. 3 months post-Champa, Xavier had begun noticing something in the wider mutant population that his most sensitive telepathic surveys could not initially explain. Certain X genes, not many, not a dramatic percentage, but a statistically significant cluster distributed across 5 continents, were producing expressions that had no precedent in the recorded history of mutant evolution. Not new powers exactly, new qualities of existing powers. Mutants with energy manipulation abilities finding that their power carried at its edges a resonance that Xavier could only describe as foreign, a vibrational signature that his telepathic sensitivity registered as coming from a different mathematical framework than Marvel's native physics. Mutants with spatial manipulation finding that their power occasionally, briefly, operated on principles closer to the instant transmission mechanics of Universe 6 than to the dimensional manipulation of Marvel's own reality. The contamination was surfacing in biology. In the X gene itself, Marvel's most famous evolutionary wildcard, apparently wild enough to incorporate foreign universal mathematics into its expression set when those mathematics became sufficiently present in the foundational substrate. Xavier sat with this data for a month before bringing it to anyone, because the implications of it ran in 2 directions simultaneously, towards something potentially extraordinary and towards something potentially catastrophic, and he needed to understand which direction was dominant before he handed the information to people who would immediately begin trying to weaponize one or panic about the other. Reed Richards assembled a private working group, himself, Xavier, Strange, Tony, and Shuri, whose combination of vibranium expertise and theoretical physics framework made her essential for anything involving the new ore, and they spent 3 weeks going through every piece of data available on the contamination's physical manifestations. What emerged from those 3 weeks was a picture that was simultaneously more alarming and more interesting than any of them had individually expected. The contamination was not random. It was not distributing itself evenly through Marvel's foundational substrate the way a spilled liquid distributes through a surface. It was organizing, clustering around points of existing power concentration, gravitating toward locations and beings and materials that already operated at or near the edges of Marvel's native physics. As if Universe 6's foreign mathematics were attracted to the places in Marvel's reality where the local equations were already being stretched, already operating at their maximum complexity, already most receptive to the introduction of new variables. The ore under Wakanda had appeared directly beneath the world's largest vibranium deposit, the most complex energy-absorbing material in Marvel's native periodic table. The X-gene expressions were appearing in the most powerful and most unusual existing mutant signatures. The contamination was not invading Marvel's reality, it was integrating with its most advanced elements. Reed spent a long time looking at that pattern before saying very quietly to the assembled group, "It's not a contamination, it's a conversation." Nobody responded immediately. Then Shuri said, "Between whose mathematics and ours?" Reed said, "That's exactly the right question." Strange said, "And we have no idea what the other side of the conversation is saying." Tony looked at all of them. "So we're getting notes passed to us in a language we can't read, from a universe we can't contact, via the biology of our most powerful people and the ground under our most advanced nation." He paused. "This is either the best thing that's ever happened to us, or the worst." Nobody was able to tell him which. The superhero community's response to the contamination data was, predictably, divided along the lines that the superhero community always divided along when confronted with information that could be read as either opportunity or threat. The faction that saw opportunity pointed to the potential. Foreign universal mathematics integrating with Marvel's most advanced materials and most powerful genetics. The implications for technology, for medicine, for the expansion of what mutant and cosmic abilities could accomplish were staggering. If Universe 6's physics could produce beings capable of the casual destructions Champa had demonstrated, then fragments of those physics integrated into Marvel's native framework might, over time, produce capabilities that Marvel's universe had no natural pathway to on its own. This was the Reed Richards position, the Shuri position, the position of everyone who had spent their lives at the frontier of what was possible and found that frontier's expansion inherently, compulsively exciting. The faction that saw threat pointed to everything else. They pointed to the fact that they had no framework for predicting or controlling what the integration would produce. They pointed to the 412 missing Kree crew members and noted that Champa's mathematics had already demonstrated, in the most irreversible way available, what they were capable of at full expression. They pointed to the fundamental asymmetry of the situation. Marvel's universe was being changed by a process it had not consented to, could not stop, and could not fully read, originating from an interaction with a being that had not been interested in their consent. This was the Steve Rogers position, the position of everyone who had learned, through hard experience, that the things you couldn't control had a tendency to become the things that controlled you. Tony built anyway. Because Tony always built. Because building was the only language he had for saying, "I am still here, and I am still trying," in a universe that had recently demonstrated, with considerable thoroughness, that trying did not guarantee outcomes. He began, in the months following the contamination data, a project he called, privately in the notes that existed only on systems nobody else had access to, the Architecture Initiative. Not a weapon, not a defense system in the conventional sense. Something more fundamental and more difficult. An attempt to build a framework for reading the contamination. For developing from first principles, a translation methodology that could take the foreign mathematical expressions surfacing in Wakandan ore and mutant X genes and begin to decode what they were actually saying. He did not expect to complete it in his lifetime. He built it anyway. Because the alternative, sitting with an untranslated message and deciding not to try to read it, was not something Tony Stark's particular architecture of self could accommodate. The message was there. Someone had to attempt the translation. It might as well be him. And if what he eventually decoded turned out to be something beautiful rather than something catastrophic, if Universe 6's mathematics surfacing in Marvel's most advanced biology and most complex materials turned out to be, as Reed had suggested, a conversation rather than a contamination, then the work would have been worth doing. And if it turned out to be the other thing? Well, he had spent most of his life building things to address the other thing. He was not going to stop now because the scale had gotten larger. The ordinary people adapted with the specific and remarkable stubbornness of a species that had survived ice ages and plagues and the repeated near destruction of their civilization by forces it had no right to survive, and had somehow arrived, each time, at the other side of the unsurvivable thing, still making breakfast and sending children to school and arguing about things that mattered at their scale, even when the universe had recently demonstrated that scale was relative. The bakery in Lyon stayed open. Marguerite kept making croissants and kept leaving a small plate of them on the doorstep each morning, and when journalists asked her why, she said, "Because if he comes back, I want him to know the address." She said it completely seriously. Some people found this funny. Some found it deeply comforting. A few found it, for reasons they struggled to articulate, the most strategically sophisticated position anyone in the Marvel Universe had taken on the post-Champa reality, because it was the only position that started from honest acknowledgement of the situation as it actually was, rather than as anyone wished it to be, and built a response from there. And here is the thing about that response, the thing that the next chapter is about. Because 1 year after Champa's departure, someone finally asked the question that all of this had been building toward. Not a political question, not a strategic one. A university lecture hall in Cape Town, 300 graduate students, one professor with enough intellectual honesty to essay out loud what everyone in the Marvel Universe had been thinking privately since the morning the violet gold light disappeared. And the answer that came back, from the back row, from a student who had grown up watching that light through a bedroom window, was the most honest thing the post-Champa universe had yet produced. And it was not reassuring. And it was not meant to be. It was meant to be true. Stay with me for one more chapter, because this is where the story stops being about what happened and starts being about what it means, and what it means is the part that stays with you. 1 year after Champa's departure, on an ordinary Wednesday morning with no cosmic significance and no alignment of divine forces and no particular reason for anything important to happen, a theoretical physicist named Dr. Amara Osei walked into a university lecture hall in Cape Town, set her notes on the podium, looked out at 300 graduate students who had signed up for a course called Advanced Cosmological Theory and had received for the past semester something considerably more urgent than theory, and asked a question. Not a complex question, not a mathematically sophisticated one, the simplest, most direct question that the entire post-Champa period had been circling for a full year, without anyone in an official capacity being willing to stand in front of an audience and actually say out loud. She said, "If Champa came back tomorrow, and this time he was not in a good mood, what would we actually do?" 300 graduate students sat with that question in a silence that their professor would later describe as the most educationally significant silence of her 40-year career. Not the silence of people who didn't have thoughts. The silence of people whose thoughts had all arrived simultaneously at the same destination and were sitting there, looking at each other. Here waiting for someone to be the first to say what that destination was. Then a student in the back row, 19 years old, grew up in Johannesburg, had watched the violet gold light through a bedroom window at the age of 8, and had been thinking about it ever since, raised his hand and said, "I don't think we'd do anything. I think we'd just find out what happened next." Nobody argued. The silence that followed was a different kind, not the silence of no answer, but the silence of the right answer landing in a room that had been hoping for a different one. The question metastasized. That is the only accurate word for what it did. It spread with the specific velocity of an idea that articulates something everyone has been thinking but nobody has yet found the language for, moving from that lecture hall outward through every layer of the post-Champa universe with the efficiency of something that had been waiting for exactly this moment to become expressible. It appeared in academic journals within weeks, reframed in the careful, measured language of cosmological threat assessment. It appeared in government briefings within months, reframed in the careful, measured language of strategic contingency planning, which was, in practice, the language governments used when they wanted to think about something terrifying without having to fully acknowledge how terrifying it was. It appeared in Asgardian philosophical correspondence, in Shi'ar imperial strategy documents, in Kree military reassessment protocols. It appeared in Tony Stark's private project notes under a heading that read, in the flat, honest language he used when nobody was watching, the actual question. In every context, under every linguistic framework applied to it, the question produced the same result. A moment of clarity so clean and so cold it was almost comfortable, followed immediately by the specific discomfort of clarity that reveals a problem with no available solute. Jan. What would Marvel do if Champa returned with bad intentions? The answer, in every context, reached by every intelligence operating on every scale, was identical. Whatever he allowed them to do. Nothing more, nothing less, and the universe had to decide what to build on top of that answer. Dr. Strange was asked the question directly, in an interview arranged by a journalist who had demonstrated, over the course of 2 years of post-Champa reporting, a commitment to asking the questions that official sources preferred remained unasked. Strange sat with it for longer than the journalist expected, long enough that the recording captured 17 seconds of silence before he responded. 17 seconds that would later be replayed in documentary footage as a measure of how genuinely the question had reached something in him that his practiced composure did not automatically cover. When he spoke, it was not with the measured authority of the Sorcerer Supreme delivering a prepared institutional position. It was with the specific, slightly raw quality of honesty that emerges when someone has stopped performing competence and started simply telling the truth about what they actually know and don't know. He said, "The question assumes that, what would we do is the relevant question, and I'm no longer certain it is. After everything that happened, after the living tribunal's convening, after Death's Gap, after the contamination data, I think the relevant question might be different. It might be, what do we become? What kind of universe? What kind of civilization? What kind of intelligence do we choose to be, knowing that forces like Champa exist, can visit us without warning, and cannot be addressed through any mechanism we currently possess?" The journalist asked whether that was a more hopeful framing or a more frightening one. Strange thought about it with genuineness, the way people think about things when they are not performing thought, but actually doing it. "Both," he said, "which is probably the most honest thing I can offer you. The power scaling community, and I know you're here, I see you in the comments, and this section is specifically for you, went absolutely nuclear with the question. Because the question had a specific sub-question embedded in it that the Dragon Ball and Marvel fandoms had been circling since day one of this entire event, and that sub-question was this: was there anyone in Marvel's entire cosmic hierarchy who could force a genuine stalemate with Champa? Not beat him. Not stop him permanently. Force a stalemate. Produce enough resistance, enough metaphysical friction, enough of whatever the equivalent of a credible deterrent was at divine scale to make the cost of continuing feel, to a being operating on Champa's mathematics, not worth the afternoon. The candidates circulated and were debated with the specific passionate intensity of communities that take fictional power hierarchies as seriously as most people take real ones. The one above all, Marvel's supreme creative principle, the source of all that exists, was the obvious answer, but the one above all did not intervene in the conventional sense, operating at a level so removed from direct engagement that invoking it felt less like a strategic option and more like hoping the universe's author decided to edit the scene. The living tribunal, with its comprehensive jurisdictional authority over Marvel's reality, had already demonstrated its limitation. It had no reach over extra-jurisdictional divine forces, and Champa was precisely that. Eternity, the embodiment of the universe itself, had felt him and done nothing, not from weakness, but from the jurisdictional impossibility that Strange had identified and that Eternity had confirmed, which left a question that the comment sections of every relevant video, every Reddit thread, every fan forum that had been running hot for a year had not yet resolved to anyone's satisfaction. At what point in Marvel's abstract hierarchy did the authority to address a foreign god of destruction actually begin? Thor's answer to the question was not philosophical and not strategic and not expressed in any format that academic journals or government briefings or comment section debates would have recognized as a formal position. It was expressed in the Skald's account he had been writing since the Norwegian sea crater. That ancient Asgardian form of narrative poetry that was designed not to record events accurately, but to capture their meaning in the compressed, resonant language of story. He had been working on it for a year. It had changed in that year considerably from what he had initially intended. He had set out to write about the confrontation, about the gap, about the specific experience of throwing everything you had at something and watching it matter approximately as much as a crumb on a divine sash. What he kept finding himself writing about instead was the question itself. The question of what it meant to keep going in full knowledge of the gap, to keep being Thor, god of thunder, protector of realms, not from the comfortable position of believing that protection was guaranteed by his power, but from the honest position of understanding its limits with crystalline clarity and choosing, in full knowledge of those limits, to stand in front of things anyway. He wrote, "The horizon that expands does not become less terrifying by expanding. It becomes more honest, and a god who cannot face an honest horizon is not a god worth the name." He kept this to himself for 6 months. Then he read it to Steve Rogers, because Steve Rogers was the person he trusted most with honest things. Rogers sat with it for a long time. Then he said, "Write it down somewhere permanent." Thor asked why. Rogers said, "Because people need to hear it. Not the ones who already know, the ones who are deciding whether to keep going." Vados, in the cosmological topology of Universe 6, had filed her report on Marvel's Universe 3 weeks after their return. It was thorough, as her reports always were. Comprehensive, precisely structured, delivered in the format that the angel hierarchy preferred, which was to say, complete, honest, and entirely without sentimentality. She noted the physical characteristics of the universe. She noted the power scaling of its primary entities. She noted the foreign variable contamination and its compounding trajectory, which she had been monitoring passively since their departure, because Vados monitored things passively as a matter of constitutional habit. She noted the food quality, specifically the brioche, which she assessed as genuinely exceptional for a mortal-tier civilization, a designation that in angel evaluative frameworks represented the highest available praise for anything produced below divine tier. And then, at the end of her report, in the section reserved for miscellaneous observations relevant to future interactions, she included one note that she had spent considerable time deciding whether to include, because it was not the kind of observation that typically appeared in angel assessments. It was more personal than that, more specific. She wrote, "The inhabitants of this universe, when confronted with a force entirely beyond their operational parameters, demonstrated a behavioral pattern not commonly observed in civilizations at their developmental stage. They did not stop. They did not adapt to helplessness. They continued attempting, not from ignorance of their limitations, which became rapidly apparent to all parties, but from what appears to be a constitutional inability to accept limitation as a terminal condition. This is either a profound flaw or a profound strength. Recommend further observation to determine which." She filed the report. Champa never read it, because Champa did not read reports, but the Grand Priest did. And the Grand Priest, who had observed more civilizations across more universes than any being currently in existence, read Vados's final note twice. Then he set it aside. Then he picked it up again. And on his face, for approximately 3 seconds, was an expression that people who knew him well would have recognized as rare and significant. Not approval exactly, interest. The specific, ancient, dangerous interest of a being who has seen everything and has just encountered something that does not fit neatly into the category of everything. The Marvel Universe, in the comprehensive and indifferent accounting of a hierarchy it had not known existed 2 years ago, had been noticed, not for its power, not for its cosmic architecture or its abstract entities or its accumulated history of impossible survival, for its stubbornness, for its constitutional refusal to process limitation as a final answer, whether that would protect it or endanger it further, whether being interesting to the hierarchy above Champa was a gift or a threat, or simply a new and more complex version of the same problem. That question sat at the center of everything that came next. And what came next, in the final chapter of this story, was the moment that made everything that preceded it feel like preparation. The moment that made every adaptation, every rebuilt protocol, every philosophical recalibration, every croissant left on a doorstep suddenly feel not like responses to something that had ended, but rehearsals for something that was only just beginning. 18 months after Champa left, an ordinary Tuesday morning, no sword alert, No tremor in the Odin force. No deep frequency disturbance registering in the Sanctum Sanctorum's most sensitive monitors. No reading of any kind on any instrument in any monitoring system that Marvel's entire post-Champa infrastructure upgrade had produced. And that infrastructure was, by this point, considerably more sophisticated than anything that had existed before his visit, built from 18 months of motivated engineering, mystical recalibration, and the specific focused urgency of a civilization that had decided, collectively, and at every level simultaneously, that it was never again going to be caught without warning. All of that infrastructure, all of that preparation, all of those upgraded sensors and recalibrated mystical frameworks and redesigned cosmic early warning relays. And the first indication that anything had changed on that Tuesday morning came not from any of it. It came from a 9-year-old boy in Cape Town, the city where Dr. Osai had asked her question, which felt, in retrospect, like the universe maintaining a specific and deliberate continuity, who looked up from his breakfast, pointed at the kitchen window, and said to his mother, "The sky is the wrong color again." His mother turned, and there it was. At the upper edge of the atmosphere, at the precise coordinates that every sensor in Marvel's upgraded network had been calibrated to watch, lasting for exactly 30 seconds before disappearing as completely and as silently as it had appeared, a point of violet gold light, small, contained, almost gentle, compared to what it had been 18 months ago, but unmistakable. Absolutely, completely, bone-deep, unmistakable. He had come back. He had looked. And then he had left. The sword alert reached Director Brand's desk 40 seconds later. She read it once. She read it again. She set it down, picked it up, set it down again. The physical repetition of a person whose analytical mind was functioning correctly and whose body was doing something independently of that function. The alert did not say arrival. It did not say engagement or threat assessment required or any of the 47 standard classifications that SWORD's post-Champa protocols had been built to deploy automatically upon confirmed contact. It said, in the flat technical language of systems designed to describe things that exceed their designers' expectations: anomalous divine signature, extra-jurisdictional, duration 30 seconds, origin Universe 6, status departed, 30 seconds. He had been there for 30 seconds, produced no detectable energy output, made no contact with any Marvel entity or instrument or structure, and left. Brand stared at that alert for a long time. Then she did something that she had not done since the original 7 days. She called Strange directly, without routing it through any official channel, without preparing a briefing document, without the professional infrastructure that normally mediated communications at their respective levels. She called him the way people call each other when the official infrastructure feels inadequate to the weight of what needs to be said. He picked up on the second ring. She read the alert to him. There was a silence on the line. Then Strange said, in the specific tone of a man who has been carrying a question for 18 months and has just received information that changes its shape without answering it, "He wasn't visiting, he was checking." Brand asked, "Checking what?" Strange said, "I don't know yet, but I intend to find out." He hung up. She looked at the alert for another long moment. Then she looked at the window, at the ordinary Tuesday sky above the ordinary Tuesday city, and she thought about a 9-year-old boy pointing at a kitchen window and saying the sky was the wrong color again. And she thought about the word again. The specific, casual, matter-of-fact quality of it, the way children used words like again for things that adults desperately hoped were once, and she understood something that all of her strategic training and all of her post-Champa protocol development had not quite prepared her for. For that child, the violet gold light was not a crisis. It was a recurrence. Something that had happened before and could happen again, and was, in the accounting of a 9-year-old who had grown up in the post-Champa world, simply part of what the sky sometimes did. The universe had already moved on, whether Marvel was ready for that or not. Thor received the alert through Asgardian channels and did what he had been doing with impossible things for 18 months. He went to the observatory. The same chair, the same coordinates, the same sky, different universe than the one it had been above 2 years ago. He had been here before in the immediate aftermath, and he had been here regularly since, because the observatory had become, in the post-Champa period, the place where he went to think about the things that didn't fit inside normal thinking. He pulled out the Scald's account. He had expanded it significantly over 18 months. It had grown from the original meditation on divine scale into something longer and stranger and more honest than anything he had previously written. He turned to the most recent section, written 3 days ago, before the 32nd return, because some part of him that he had stopped arguing with had apparently known it was coming. He read, "A god who only stands when victory is certain stands for nothing. Certainty is a comfort, not a calling. The horizon expands. The honest thing is to keep walking toward it regardless of what the expansion reveals." He closed the account. He looked at the sky. The ordinary too. Esday sky, with its ordinary clouds and its ordinary light, and its zero visible trace of anything extraordinary. He thought about Champa, somewhere in the topology of Universe 6, checking something on a Tuesday morning before presumably returning his attention to whatever divine business occupied a god of destruction between casual universe-altering visits. He thought about what checking meant. What you checked on when you were a god of destruction with the entirety of your own universe to occupy your attention. You checked on things that had become interesting, things that had, against reasonable expectation, continued to exist in ways you had not entirely anticipated. Things that had done something, in your presence or in your absence, that had not fit the standard pattern for things at their level. Thor thought about Vados's report, which Strange had eventually obtained fragments of through channels he declined to specify, and the Grand Priest's response to it. The interest, the specific, dangerous, ancient interest of a hierarchy that had seen everything and had found something that didn't fit neatly into everything. He thought about whether being interesting to that hierarchy was a gift or a threat. Then he thought about the answer the Cape Town student had given in the lecture hall, the answer that had been circulating for a year because it was the only completely honest answer anyone had produced. "I don't think we'd do anything. I think we'd just find out what happened next." Thor looked at that answer from inside the observatory and understood it in a way he had not understood it the first time he heard it. It was not resignation. It was not helplessness. It was the specific courage of a being that had made peace with uncertainty, not by resolving the uncertainty, but by deciding that uncertainty was not a reason to stop. Somewhere in the cosmological topology of Universe 6, in spaces that Marvel's instruments could not map and Marvel's languages had no words for, Champa was having a conversation with Vados that had started, as most of their conversations started, as a complaint about something food-adjacent and had evolved, as their conversations occasionally did when Champa was in a rare, contemplative mood, into something more substantive. He had returned from the 30-second check with the specific expression he wore when something had confirmed a suspicion he had not previously admitted to holding. Vados had waited, with the patience of someone who had several million years of experience waiting for Champa to get to the point, and had eventually said, "And?" Champa had looked at her. Then he had looked away. Then he had said, in the particular tone he reserved for admissions he found mildly irritating to make, "The mathematics are settling. The contamination is integrating properly." Vados had sipped her drink. "As projected." "Their biology is taking it," Champa said. "Some of them. The strong ones." Vados had nodded pleasantly. "Also, as projected." Champa had been quiet for a moment, a rare enough event that Vados had looked up from her drink to observe it properly. Then he had said, "They put a picture on the wall of their biggest building. A child's drawing. Of me." Vados had waited. "It said hello," Champa said. The silence that followed was the specific silence of someone who has received a greeting from something considerably smaller than themselves and is deciding, for the first time, how they feel about it. "That's all," he said. "Just, hello." Vados looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, with the precise, careful pleasantness she deployed when she was saying something genuinely true, "That is, Lord Champa, a more sophisticated opening diplomatic move than most civilizations at their level manage." Champa made a non-committal sound. He looked at the space where other universes existed in the cosmological topology of their reality. The positions, the signatures. the faint suggestions of civilizations going about their small and earnest business in their small and earnest realities. His eyes rested, for longer than a glance but shorter than a decision, on one particular position. Then he said, "The bread was good." Vados said, "It was excellent, actually." Champa said nothing more, but he did not look away. The contamination percentage updated on the same Tuesday morning of the 32nd return. The Celestials' instruments recorded 0.007%, double the original reading, precisely on the compounding curve they had projected. Somewhere beneath Wakanda, the ore deposit had expanded by a factor of 3. In the wider mutant population, Xavier's latest survey had identified 47 new X-gene expressions carrying Universe 6's foreign mathematical signature, up from 12 at the 6-month mark, up from 23 at the 12-month mark. The curve was consistent, the integration was proceeding. Reed Richards running the updated numbers through his modeling framework at 3 in the morning in a lab that smelled of cold coffee and contained, in various stages of construction, 12 different attempts to build a translation methodology for the foreign mathematics, looked at the new data and felt the specific emotion he felt when a pattern revealed itself clearly enough to read. Not joy, not fear, but the clean, complicated excitement of a problem becoming legible. He pulled up the projection curves. He ran them forward. At the current compounding rate, within 100 years, the foreign mathematical integration would be producing observable effects at a scale visible without celestial-grade instruments. Within 500 years, the integration would represent a significant enough portion of Marvel's foundational substrate to begin generating what Reed's modeling framework could only describe as emergent phenomena. New physical possibilities, new metaphysical capabilities, new categories of being that Marvel's universe would not have been able to produce from its own native equations alone. Universe 6's mathematics were not contaminating Marvel's reality. They were, slowly, carefully, at the pace of compounding inevitability, expanding it, making it capable of things it had not previously been capable of. The universe Champa had casually, accidentally, through the simple fact of his relaxed presence altered in its deepest substrate, was becoming, over the timescale of centuries, something larger than it had been before he arrived. Not stronger in the way Marvel's heroes were strong. Larger in the way that a vocabulary becomes larger when a new language introduces words that the original language had no equivalent for. Reed stared at that projection for a very long time. Then he wrote, in the private notes that nobody else had access to, 2 words that he had not previously been willing to write down, because writing them down made them real, and real was a category he had needed more time to adjust to. "Thank you." He stared at those 2 words. He did not delete them. He closed the document and went to find coffee, and when he came back he opened it again and the 2 words were still there, and he decided for the first time that they were right. And so, here is where we land. Here is the gut-punch truth at the center of this entire story. The thing that all 10 chapters have been building toward. The thing that the Living Tribunal's revised jurisdictional framework and Death's Gap and Thor's Scald's account and Marguerite's croissants and a child's drawing on a U. N. Wall and Reed Richards 3 a.m. thank you were all, in their different ways, trying to say. The Marvel Universe survived Champa's visit. That is true. It is also, on its own, the least interesting true thing about what happened. The interesting true thing. The thing that should keep you up at night. The thing that should make you want to argue about it in the comments. The thing that sits at the center of this story like a stone that changes the shape of everything around it, is why it survived, and what surviving on those terms actually means going forward. It did not survive because it was strong enough. We established that in Chapter 3, in 11 minutes of failed tiered response protocol. It did not survive because it was clever enough. We established that in 9 hours of Illuminati deliberation that produced one actionable conclusion. Don't make him angrier than he already isn't. It survived because a god of destruction ate well, found the entertainment insufficient, and decided his afternoon was better spent elsewhere. And then, and this is the part that changes the shape of everything, it turned out that in the process of being briefly, casually, accidentally present, that bored god of destruction had done something to this universe at its most fundamental level that its own most powerful forces could not have done deliberately. He had expanded it, not broken it, not ended it. Expanded it, written new mathematical possibilities into its deepest substrate, introduced foreign equations that were, slowly, permanently, irreversibly making Marvel's reality capable of things it could not previously have been capable of. The most transformative event in the history of the Marvel Universe was not a war. It was not a sacrifice or a discovery or a heroic act of impossible will. It was a bored god eating bread and leaving crumbs. Because here is the final truth this story has been carrying since Chapter 1, since that lazy, devastating voice asked who had the best food, since Thor recalibrated in a Norwegian sea crater, and Strange went quiet in his library, and a 7-year-old in Mumbai drew a picture that ended up on a UN wall. The most terrifying part of Champa entering Marvel was never the battles he almost started. It was never the Kree cruiser folded out of existence, or the asteroids deleted in a moment of sartorial irritation, or the Scarlet Witch's probability wave flickering for 3 seconds against a divine aura and producing nothing but the most expensive hope in the universe's history. The most terrifying part was not even the 30-second return, the glance cast back from the doorway of a reality that was not his, at a civilization that still could not know what the glance meant or what it would eventually become. The most terrifying part was the discovery the Marvel Universe made about itself, about the nature of its own survival, about the ground that all its power and courage and ancient cosmic authority and assembled genius and extraordinary stubborn constitutional refusal to accept limitation as a terminal condition was actually built on. The ground is not strength. The ground is not adequacy. The ground is this: they are still here because destruction found them interesting enough to alter and not interesting enough to end. And somewhere in the topology of Universe 6, not fully decided, thinking about bread and ocean light and a child's drawing that said hello, destruction had not yet determined which category they ultimately belonged in. So, I'll ask you this. If Champa came back tomorrow, not for a visit, not for 30 seconds, but properly, with a bad day behind him and nowhere better to be, who in the entire Marvel Universe steps up first, and who realizes before it is over that the only thing standing between this universe and erasure was never a hero, never a cosmic entity, never a weapon or a ward of mystical authority? Who realizes it was always, only always, the food? Drop it in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happens when the wrong god walks through the right universe, you know where the subscribe button is. Don't make him wait.